Hello, my fellow sequestered quilters. It's 2 o'clock and it's day 3 of the stay-at-home order. And I'm really happy and excited to be here with you today again. And I really am starting to look forward to this time of the day where we get to visit and talk and catch up. So, yesterday we talked about organizing scraps and ways that we can organize them in a way that we'll be able to use them down the road. So I want to talk a little bit more about scraps and using them in quilts, and also want to talk about what I call the ever elusive scant seam. So when you sew with regular clothes, when you're in home ec, when growing up, or grandma taught you how to sew or whatever, and we were making clothes, usually the seam allowance was about 5/8 of an inch. So it was nice because you had a little bit of wiggle room just in case, you needed to make it a little bigger in an area. And then we learned how to quilt, and we had to get used to making a tiny little 1/4 inch seam. The 1/4 inch seam is very elusive, I think, because a lot of patterns will tell you use a scant 1/4 inch seam. Well, what does that mean? Well, I guess a little bit smaller than 1/4 of an inch. And when you start cutting all this beautiful fabric into all these little tiny pieces and then go to sew them back together, sometimes one seam might be 1/4 inch, one might be a little more than 1/4 inch or a little less. And then you go to put all those pieces together and they don't fit. And you get puckers, you get blocks that bubble up or don't lay right. So I've really made it a mission to try to figure out how to get my seams all the same. And some people say it doesn't really have to be exactly 1/4 of an inch as long as they're all the same. And that's true some of the time. For instance, if you're making a quilt like the one that you guys saw up on my design wall the last few days, where you've just got a bunch of these are like cut at 5.5 inches, and then I'm just sewing those all back together. The only thing that's really important there is that your seams are all the same. So finding a place on your machine where you're always going to sew on that line so that they're the same, so that when you then go to sew those 4 together, once you get all your rows and stuff, then those are going to line up, and you're not going to get puckers in your block out here. But if you are trying to sew a whole lot of pieces together, like look at this cute little tiny baby, or this cute little tiny baby, if you don't have exactly 1/4 of an inch, those rows aren't going to line up right, and it's going to be really off, and you're really going to be fighting with it. Plus, now if this block is going to go into a quilt, and say it's going to be 6 inches, if I'm off like even a couple of threads on each of those seams, pretty soon now I've got a 7-inch block. So it is really important that it is a 1/4 inch seam. And the reason that they say a scant 1/4 of an inch seam is because when you put those seams together and you press it over, it adds a little bit of bulk, and that's going to make it a bigger seam. So that's why you want it just a thread or two less than a 1/4 of an inch, especially when you're trying to do this tiny, more precise piecing. On this block, if you can see how little tiny those are, honestly, the best way to do that is to have a little bit bigger piece and then trim each row as you sew it on. So that's a little hint too. That's kind of cheatery, but it gets the job done. So a great way to get a good 1/4 inch seam is to have a good 1/4 inch foot that will fit on your machine. Most machines, you usually have to buy them extra. They don't usually come standard. Unless you're buying one that is really made for quilting, then those a lot of time will have a 1/4 inch foot. So this just pops in place of my other one. And you can see the red marks on this one. So that's a 1/4 inch. The reason those 2 little red marks are there is because that's a 1/4 inch here to here as well. And that comes in really handy when I'm putting on bindings and stuff. But anyway, the edge of my foot is 1/4 of an inch. And I have found even that's really pretty precise, 1/4 of an inch. But if I want that scant 1/4 of an inch, I do it in just a hair in from the edge of the foot. And that works out well for me. So one way, or another way that you can do it, there are a couple tools out there. Different companies or different people sell these little rulers, and it has a little hole right there in the top of it. You put your needle down, take your foot off your machine, put your needle down in there, and then you're 1/4 of an inch here. And then you can buy like little sticky tapes, or you can put a sticky note or tape down your own something right next to it, and then take this away. And then you would line your fabric up right with the edge of that tape or marker, whatever you put. That can help you get a good 1/4 of an inch as well. Now, I have to say from experience of long arm quilting, lots of different quilts, that it does really make a big difference when long arm quilting quilts if they're pieced well. So I do like the idea of a done quilt is better than a perfect quilt. I am by no means a perfectionist. In fact, I have this little sign right over there next to all my things, and it says, "Striving for excellence is worthwhile. Striving for perfection is insanity." And I completely agree with that. But striving for excellence and always wanting to get better is a good thing. Not perfection, but always getting better, striving to improve our skills. I think that's my goal. That's what I try to do. So I have a couple of other tricks. Oh, well, let me get back to why it's important if they're pieced well on the quilting machine, because if the blocks are different sizes and there's tucks there, it's just going to get magnified when it gets quilted. The fullness as the machine's going around it might quilt in some puckers into the quilt as well. So just a little FYI. Okay, now I want to talk about this quilt back here. I get asked a lot of times, since I do quilting for a business, if I ever get to make any of my own stuff. And the answer to that is yes, I do, because even though quilting is my job, it is still my hobby as well. I love to make quilts. And so I always make sure that I make time to do my own stuff. A lot of times it's on the weekends. That'll be my time. I try not to too much work on customer stuff on the weekend. I try and work on my own stuff. And this quilt back here, yesterday we were talking about all those scraps that we save and everything. This quilt is made with all pretty much scraps. And if you're interested at all in the pattern, it's I think you can still find the pattern on the website All People Quilt, and it's called Tone It Down Quilt. And the reason they call it that is because all of the background fabric is what we call low volume fabric. So you can see that it's not just a plain white or a plain cream that's in the background. All those white pieces have a little bit of print, a little bit of color in them. Some of them I ran out of, and I thought maybe they had too much print and not enough background. And so I turned those pieces backwards and it made them even lighter. So that was fun. But the reason I want to talk about this quilt is this right here is a block. Okay, and then it's got sashing around it too. So just this piece right here, that block is 97 pieces in each block. So the first block that I made, I cut all my pieces. And by the way, the first step to getting accurate 1/4 inch seams and your blocks to all line up is in your cutting. So even in your cutting, it's really important that you're really precise. If you have to wear reading glasses, make sure that you put your reading glasses on when you're cutting so you can see those lines. Also, it's really recommended. I don't always do this because maybe I'm cutting different sizes, but it's highly recommended that you always use the same ruler when you're cutting for a whole entire quilt. Like, always use that ruler, because, or at least for sure the same brand of ruler. Because like I have several rulers. Some are Omni grids, some are the creative grids. So I have several different brands of rulers, but once you start cutting out a quilt, you should use the same ruler so that they all stay the same measurement. So anyway, the first block I put together, had all my pieces cut, just started, sewing them together in a row, like each 97 piece block was a little quilt. And I had a lot of issues with the seams not lining up and things not coming together right. And I was really unhappy with the first block. So then I decided to break it up into pieces, into sections, each block. So like this center little 9 patch here, I would sew that all together. When I got that one section of the block done, I got my ruler back out again, and I lined up and made sure that that was 4 inches or whatever size it was supposed to be. Same thing with all these little 4 patches, sewed those together, and then measured it, trimmed off if it wasn't quite the right size. And then that way, these 9 patches, so then that way, then when I put all those bigger sections together, I had a lot better luck with that. The other thing I always do if I have a quilt with 1/4 inch triangles or half square triangles, like this quilt here is one of my quilts that I wrote the pattern for. You can find it on my website, which is donnasdesignthreads.com. And this, see all of these half square triangles in this block? I made the half square triangles a little bit bigger than what size finished I wanted it, or what size cut I wanted it. And then I trimmed every single one. And I know that's a lot of extra work, but the more preciseness and keeping all of those little points to come out in the block is worth it, I think. So I wanted to show you that. Now, let me see. One other thing. Oh, I wanted to tell you guys. So I want to go back to scraps again because I have a little confession to make. Yesterday, I didn't really show you all of the places that I have scraps stashed. So I'm going to show you a little bit more of my insanity. This little box I keep by my sewing machine has probably 1 million or 2 half square triangles. When I make those quilts that they have you put a square in the corner and then trim it off to get the corner pop, I guess it's called. I just can't throw those away. So I save all those. I have a ton of half square triangles that are waiting to be, and then I use those as leaders and enders, like when I'm sewing rows together and I have to not chain piece anymore and I've got to take it off, then I'll sew a little half square triangle together instead of just cutting the thread and having the strings out. So this box is they're already all sewn together. They just need to be pressed. And then this box has already been pressed and trimmed. And this box, I think those have been pressed and trimmed too. This box here, these have been pressed but not trimmed. So, I can just take them upstairs, get out a little cutting mat while I'm watching TV or something in the evening and trim those up. That's a little bit insane, and I probably should throw some of that stuff out, but I just can't. And then I have even littler pieces. I showed you my box of 2.5 inch squares. These are from like 1.5 inch squares. And so what I want to show you with this though, that's just those sewn together. Here's all of those littler pieces. Okay, so we're going to use this little ruler here. I'm going to show you one more way to check and see if you have 1/4 inch seams, a scant 1/4 inch, when you're checking on your machine. So I showed you with the little ruler how you can make a mark on your machine. Okay, and then, all right, if I have 2 1.5 inch pieces to sew together, after I sew the 2 together, so I'm going to sew this one to this one, right? So 1.5 plus 1.5 is 3 inches. When I do a 1/4 inch seam, I'm going to lose 1/4 of an inch on each piece. So now it should be 2.5 inches, right? Yeah, 2.5 inches. So these two are sewn together. They're 2.5 inches. So take your two small pieces, your 1.5 and your 1.5, and then sew it together real quick. And then once you press it, like just how you're going to press, and then remeasure. So you're going to remeasure and make sure that that comes out at 2.5 inches. So that's a good way to double check how your seams are doing. Speaking of pressing, you notice I say the word press and not iron, because when you iron, you're like really ironing. I say iron it into submission. Sometimes you have to do that with quilts, but you got to be really careful because fabric will stretch out and it'll get wonky and rippled and all kinds of crazy if you're pressing where you're ironing. So just press. Make sure it's nice and flat and press. You can move the iron a little bit. I don't know, it's just habit to do that, but make sure you're not really pressing down and ironing that too much. I think that's about all that I wanted to talk to you about. Oh, I'm getting your blocks more accurate. It's really important to pin at the intersections. And if at all possible, when you are pressing, think about how your block's going to go together. Press one direction, the next row the other direction, so that those seams can butt up to each other and nest. That's a good way to make sure your quilt blocks lay flat too. I'm sure there's so much more information that I could give you guys about, or that any other people could give us about making more accurate quilts. And so if you guys have any tips or tricks or things that work for you, let me know about it. I'll be happy to share it with you. And I want to thank you guys for joining me today, and make sure that you are taking care of yourself and that you are being continuously creative. And I will see you guys tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Bye.